say something because something pinged into my mind earlier on today, and it's in response to the recent attack on a lot of victims that are coming forward and making allegations, and some of these victims are coming very high profile. And I've alluded to this in a few of my interviews in the past, and it's how the law is being used on the surface as a benevolent source, but the undercurrent is one a lot more sinister. And I mentioned about bad character, and this comes from the Criminal Justice Act of 2003. And it was brought about, and its reception was very welcomed, because it was showing that people that had a propensity to commit a certain type of crime being sort of exposed at the beginning of a trial. So I'll explain that in as much as some people that were found not guilty of burglary, at the end of the trial, when their offences were read out, and it was shown that they had 40, 50 like offences, and the jury was shocked. So change was brought about. Well, the perception of change was brought about, and this act was brought in so that people that had like offences could be exposed during the trial. So if someone had committed burglary, they'll be classed as a person of dishonesty. And it's only really on looking at what's been going on with the victims and survivors, how they are demonised when they're coming into court. And as I've said in the past, so many people that have become victim to these horrendous crimes have turned to self-medication and alcohol and drugs, and one of their drugs of choice is heroin. And to fund that habit, people then go into like committing crimes of shoplifting, etc., which are crimes of dishonesty. So inevitably they get caught, and now under this new legislation get referred to as a person of dishonesty. Now when they're coming forward, if we stretch this timeline back, what made people in this situation go onto drugs in the first place, we find out that such a large percentage, 3/4 of them, 75% of them, have come from abused backgrounds. Now we're seeing a lot of victims coming forward and are exposing their abusers. And some of these people are people of note, people of position. And every attempt is being made by the mainstream media to demonise these people and class them as dishonest, and saying, how can we trust this person? This person has convictions for dishonesty, for deception, etc. Well, of course they have, because they're surviving in a situation they're in, and they end up on the drugs and end up funding this through crime. But we got to look back in history, how the British government has done this time and time again. Going back to the 1800s, when the troops were coming back from the campaigns, and the Napoleonic campaigns and the Crimean campaigns, the British Army, after they'd fought the wars, didn't need them anymore and were just getting rid of them. And a lot of these soldiers were then suffering what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, but back then there was no recognised, condition or whatever, and they were just ignoring them and making them homeless and jobless. So people were ended up on the streets. So in order to get rid of them, because they were a national embarrassment, they brought in the Vagrancy Act. I think it was of 1826. I'm not too certain, but it was in the early 1800s, to get rid of them because they were a shame on the British government. So again, they're washing the hands of those that have done them good. And then after the First World War, the British government brought in the Licensing Act. Now, people were coming back from what they call the Great War, these most horrendous campaigns in which death and destruction was commonplace. And again, these poor lads, they couldn't process this. A lot of these lads, they were farm labourers, they came from the fields, they were sent out to the most awful situations, and then they went back. Again, they couldn't cope, so they were turning, like we've all done, anyone that's been in a traumatic situation, we self-medicate. And back then, the self-medication thing of choice was alcohol. So they were getting drunk. They were going in the pubs to drown their sorrows and get rid of the pain. So they brought in the Licensing Act. And the Licensing Act was brought in to silence these people and get them back to work, because the British government at that time was on the verge of what they call a coup d'etat. People were actually refusing to go to work. They were just giving up, and they were drinking. And they did this to make sure, and if you look at the Licensing Act, you look at it is governed around the working day. And this occurred after the First World War. And we saw the same thing happen in the Second World War, when they got rid of conscription, and the theory is they got rid of conscription because a lot of these soldiers were so disgusted at what they experienced and how they were treated by the British government on their return that they also were refusing to work. And there were stories of old soldiers going onto parade grounds and removing their children from parade in the morning, saying, "You're not having my son." And then you also saw the big campaign to build council houses and working men's clubs and cheap alcohol to placate them. So we're seeing it happen back then in history, and I genuinely believe we're seeing it now with this Bad Character Act. I think it's deliberately been brought in to stop victims and survivors being believed in our judicial system. So I think we need to look a lot more into it, and we are seeing it now with the demonisation of some very, very key witnesses that have got some very, very important and powerful information which goes right to the heart of the British establishment. And I think we need to look a lot more deeper than what the mainstream media is telling us. But anyway, that was just a bit of an afterthought, and I thought I'd share it. God bless.